Hello, folks. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be sharing space with so many brilliant academics, frontline workers, artists, and organizers to have a really necessary and important conversation about anti-Black racism, specifically as it impacts Black youth in Ontario. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge today. Today is January the 29th, which is the 1 year anniversary of the shooting in the Quebec masjid that left Ibrahima Berry, Mamadou Tanu Berry, Khalid Bilqasimi, Abu Bakr Tabti, Abdul Karim Hassan, Azzuddin Swifan, having lost their lives last year. So I want to take a moment to remember them. And I also want to take a moment to remember that the history of Islamophobia in this land is also bound up deeply in anti-Blackness, as Muslims have been on this land for as long as enslaved African trafficked people have been on this land. So I want to take a moment to remember all of those people collectively and to thank you all for sharing space with us today. So we're going to be engaging with a number of questions. Some of them are a little bit more broad. Some of them are a bit more pointed. I know that some of you contributed questions in the registration process. So we've done our best to incorporate those, and we'll be taking questions from participants as the session goes on as well. So the first question that I'm going to direct to the entire panel is, how can Ontario's youth sector work against anti-Black racism to create a more equitable Ontario, eliminating systemic race-based disparities for Black children and youth? Big question, I know. Anyone want to start?
So are we just jumping into this?
You go for it, Joshua.
Alrighty, how can Ontario's youth sector work against anti-Black racism to create a more equitable Ontario, eliminating systemic race-based disparities for Black children and youth? I think that's a two-parter. As a Black youth, but also as someone who works with Black youth, how do you work against anti-Black racism to create a system that's more equitable? The first part is addressing the anti-Black racism, period, that it's present, that it exists within all facets of people. So whether you're a conservative who sees anti-Black racism as something that's of the past because the laws are dead, or you're a neoliberal or a liberal who thinks that racism is present but hasn't seen any sort of action or taken any action in their actual lives to challenge the racist things that they believe. Or, you know what, I'll go as far as to say, if you're a Black person who has internalized anti-Blackness and operates in the system as a tool of white supremacy and colonialism to act against that, it's addressing those things, admitting they exist, and then working towards them. When it comes to eliminating systemic race-based disparities for children and youth, we've had conversation. Like, I don't agree with asking the question, how do you eliminate systemic anything? Because you have to eliminate systemic problems, you have to eliminate the system in which they exist. And I think the people who want to ask that question 9 times out of 10 aren't willing to actually exterminate or remove the system that exists, because we profit from it, whether we want to admit it or not. And I say we as a collective group of people living on this land. We directly benefit in some way, shape, or form from the system existing. And so if you want to talk about eliminating systemic race-based disparities, especially for Black people, how are you going to do that? The system was built on our blood. We came, sure, it wasn't, the South where they had so much farmland that you could enslave millions of us at a time, but we still had slavery across this country. We still had racial discrimination across this country that was built in by law. If it's built in by law, you have to eliminate the structure that created the laws in the first place. And so my first thing would be challenge that question. Do you really want to eliminate it, or do you want to work in such a way that we can start fixing things? We talk about harm reduction. Do we want to work in harm reduction, making this less harmful as time goes on and finding a way to change the system bit by bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that concerns me is that when we approach harm reduction and liberation as having to do one or the other, I think we absolutely can pursue our liberation. We absolutely can pursue envisioning and building a new world while making sure that people who are here now don't suffer as much. And that I would like for us to get to that new world, but I would like for a lot of us to live to see it. that would be nice, you know.
Yeah.
I saw that both Martha and Cyril were nodding a lot with some of the things that you said. Do either one of you want to expand or add?
I definitely agree with a lot that that Joshua has shared with us. You have to start with the question of intention. So systemic intention is something I think we should definitely question, but also as people that are working in one way or another within systems, what are our intentions? And I like to think about it as what are our stakes? So what's at stake for me if there's a change in the system that becomes more equitable? Do I have something to gain? Do I have something to lose? And based on a real assessment of those politics within myself, I think that can paint a picture of what's practical, what's possible in terms of some people's involvement with advocacy for other communities, in this situation, the Black community, and in terms of my own stakes in the nonprofit industrial complex that we do a lot of conversation around, and some of the capacity building activities through YouthREX and other spaces. Realizing that industry and capital is moving a lot of systems. And unless we understand that the structures of those systems require, in most cases, the subservience of large groups of people and population and the continued poverty of large population groups, and kind of like the foil character to this imagined dream character that everybody's supposed to aspire towards. We see a lot this neoliberal discourse and pulling up your own bootstraps, etc., in terms of what you aspire towards. And even as we look into the systems where the mantra is more of a social justice etiquette or approach, it's still based on the social return of investment. If you want youth to do well, they're doing well because they're going to school and they're getting jobs. So it's always navigating those contradictions between participating fully in a capitalist exploitation of your life and labor. So when you're youth, you're either a problem or you're complying. And when you're old, you're in a home because you've served your time, your body has been used of energy. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but these are important questions to kind of paint in terms of like, what is our intention? If our intention is to open up space of humanity and social justice, then we should have a real conversation about what's at stake when we want to open up those opportunities to people. So that's why I appreciate what you said, Joshua, in terms of setting the tone. And we need to understand the historic and social, political, economic context of a question like this. Right behind me and behind most of us today, we have these graphic representations that have been born out of conversations with the Critical Youth Work course that just wrapped up in December of last year. And they're identifying a number of issues: racialized LGBTQ2 SIA, Black youth facing mental health challenges, youth in conflict with the law. We had another one about immigration and some challenges as newcomer youth. And I don't want to ramble on too much. I want to share a space, but just to give some context to understanding that there are many industries implied, a lot of jobs implied, a lot of personal politics implied, and keep that broader framework in mind as we talk about issues of how can we do better. That idea of harm reduction, we'll talk about some practical things, but it's important to understand the broader context.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Martha.
I really, really appreciate their insights. Your insights, people, they're very brilliant and really right on. And I've been cut off from this field for a long time, so this is a wonderful renewal, perhaps, for me. So I thank you so much for your insights. I do want to go back to that binary you raised. I forget names, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I've never heard of this as harm reduction, but I've been in debates and real experiences of binaries, whether, we have to do revolution or we have to do reform, and if we start reforming the system, it would be strengthening the oppressive system, and need to get rid of it. So that kind of binary have been in it, in that kind of discourse. So I don't believe we have to choose one or the other, because if we talk about revolution and when the whole system crumbles or we take it down by force or whatever, if we wait for that kind of time, those who live on hope will die fasting. I think we need to get as much benefit from whatever reform we can get in this time and moment, while still working towards revolution. We don't have to choose one or the other. Yeah, so I think that is a very important piece there. Harm reduction. Yes, we need to have a bite today to be able to live tomorrow. We need to have a shelter, home, a roof under our heads to be able to see tomorrow. So we don't forego the small reforms, the small benefits that we get today in order to have it all tomorrow or 100 years later. Who knows how long we might live, whether we would see the revolution or not. So for me, I think looking at those binaries, like complexifying those binaries, it doesn't have to be reform or revolution. And the other piece is also, even in our own ways, you've talked about all of these multiplicities of our own subjectivities, our own identities. We are so many things at the same time, simultaneously. We could be oppressors to one another and oppressed at the same time. So while my biggest mantra in this case is like a pointing finger when we talk about, okay, those are the oppressors. This is the system and that should go. Josh raised a very important point here. We are in it. We are it. We are the system. How can we, not be a part of it? So for me, it's how can we be a part of it, but also be apart from it enough to take it down, right? So that's it's a very complex issue, but I think we all need to look at that, because if I don't contribute to the system, I can't function. If I wait for the system to die, I'm the one who dies first before the system.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to keep all those in mind, because we are enmeshed in it. We are inescapably tangled up with that system. So I think separating ourselves out and fighting from without may be a wishful thinking, but how do we fight? How do we engage it very critically from within? Like it's like we're in the belly of a beast. How do we eat it from the inside and make it, dissolve it away? So I don't mean to take up a lot of time, but for me, I think we need to look at these complex spaces between these extremes.
I think something that is often an experience that Black youth articulate to me, or even struggle to articulate to me, is this having to be in this place of proving their oppression. This really exhausting place of like, I know something is wrong, and I think there's a very deep-seated and overarching institutional gaslighting that happens. And gaslighting is a gender-based violence term whereby your own perception of your experience is questioned so frequently that you begin to question your own perception of your reality, and you consider your oppressor's point of view first, or your abuser's point of view first. But that's something that Black youth may not use those words specifically to name it as such, but I think something that has a tremendous power is being affirmed and being told, yes, you're not imagining this. This is real. I think that's good for our survival, for our mental health, because we spend so much of it trying to prove to a system that is very much invested in believing that these issues are not institutional, believing that they're interpersonal or social more so, and they're not a part of the way that we do things as a society, and they're not built into our laws, our policies, our procedures, into our exercises of nation building, everything. I think naming that racism and acknowledging and accepting and then examining all the ways that it's manifesting in institutional and systemic ways is really critical. And that looks like funding and money and research and resources, so that so many of us can just like and that research doesn't only look like hard data to me. It looks like also narrative and qualitative data too. I think it helps to kind of offset that experience of, is it just me? And it also challenges that choice narrative, because I think that choice narrative is very dangerous, of the you can choose to change the circumstances of your life if you try this much. The problem is with you. You are not working hard enough or trying hard enough. The problem is with you, with your community. And I think that, we see that manifesting in all sorts of ways. We see it manifesting in the criminalization of young Black children in the school system. They are hyper surveilled by their teachers from kindergarten onwards. Studies that come out and say that young Black kids are actually considered to be threatening or dangerous by people who are not Black, particularly by white people, but by all non-Black people, as young as 5 years old. And that, we can see the impact of racial disparities in everything from care in the neonatal intensive care. These babies, are like literally 0 days old. So we can see the manifestations of it from the womb to the tomb. And that for me is really important to acknowledge. And from also, like, from a personal place as a parent, and as a Black mother, is having these conversations with our children has been critical. We don't get to have the I don't see color conversation with our children. That sets them up to die at the hands of this world, right? So giving them the tools to have these conversations, to talk about it, and then also giving people the space to heal from all those really exhausting conversations, I think is really critical. I think I saw both Joshua and Cyril looked like you both had things to say, so I want to make sure that if you have some follow-ups or things you wanted to add to the question, that you get a chance to do that.
I think the dynamic between the oppressed and the oppressor is something to think about. When we think about stakes, like, what's the benefit to me? If I am a Caucasian male, what's the benefit to me to support a system of justice for those that are experiencing marginalization? Well, it's becoming a fuller human being. And even that language, humanity, I think is problematic, but I'm just using it right now because that's what I have, to communicate. But there's this energy, this essence, and how we're all connected. And as we're oppressing other people, we're also oppressing ourselves. We're restricting ourselves. Yeah. And so I think the benefit in terms of liberation, it's not just what can I do for you people to help you get liberated. Take it upon yourself, I would suggest, to see how you can be more humane in liberating yourself, to question how you may be complicit in a system that's contributing to somebody else's disenfranchisement, on a daily. And as I'm saying that, it's also something I have to look at personally. There are communities that I am also complicit in oppressing, even as a Black male. Right. And so, that's something that I am doing work, and I have to continue to work. So being socialized in the system, the oppression I may learn, and the oppression I might reproduce for women, for trans folk, for everybody that is for my Indigenous ancestors personally, but those, my own ancestry looking at me, you wouldn't see that as part of my legacy. And so how am I complicit in replicating systems of oppression for others? It's something I've got to question. And I'm, repeating that because this is something that happens on the daily and something that has to happen more. And I think it's a little frightening when we enter conversations of social justice and equity, and people take it personally, right? We'll talk about somebody else's experience, and you've got to take it personally and say, oh, I'm not this, I'm not that. There's no space for that, in my opinion, in terms of being able to have a productive resolution to move forward to equity. I'll stop there.
I think when it comes to working, I think if we want to get back to like the root of the question, what can the youth sector do? When we'll talk about intersectionality later, I'm guessing, but like the idea of acknowledging that Black people don't full stop at Black people. I think the problem a lot of systems have with looking at Black people is they look at Blackness as a monolith, and they think that Blackness only has one framework to look at. And so people forget that there are Black people who have been here for hundreds of years because their ancestors were slaves here. My ancestors come from Jamaica, and so I have an entire Caribbean context my ancestors aren't from Jamaica. They were brought to Jamaica as slaves and were kept there for hundreds of years. And so that is my context. I have friends all across Toronto who come from a West or an East or a South or Central African context, who didn't grow up, whose families didn't grow up on this side of the planet, and then come here and realize that blackness is kind of a thing, like this North American or more diaspora concept. That like you weren't black before you came here because you were surrounded by black people, and now you've come to this place and you're black, quote unquote black. And so the system, if the system doesn't recognize that, then how can the system even begin to deal with black people, let alone black people who are queer, let alone black people who don't identify on any scale of gender? How do you deal with people who are black but also have come into privilege? So have come into privilege that is economic, or haven't come into privilege that is economic. We exist across an entire spectrum of identities and thoughts. And so that's the second thing, is how do you deal with a queer black kid whose parents are upper middle class, financial upper middle class, I say that in quotes, so like who have a higher economic standing in terms of income. How do you deal with a person who comes from impoverished community but is straight, is male, and exhibits all sorts of behaviors that are oppressive to other groups? Like, and Cyril talked about that. Like, there are so many points in which we can interact with each other. Excuse me, that we had a discussion about this, and we have like this discussion in communities often. Is like we're not all one person, and like if you look at us like a World Vision commercial in Ontario, like there's no way we're gonna get anywhere, because like you can't market that idea. Like if you look at me like I have flies around my head and a swollen belly from malnourishment, I'm gonna laugh at you because I eat every day, but I still face racism. And so as a youth, how do I intersect with that? How do I deal with my youth who may have what I have or may not have what I have? And once you stop looking at us as this one singular idea, then you can start to effectively engage our communities. But until such a time, like when you say black youth and all of a sudden there's this like stamp of like me in a red hoodie with like really baggy jeans and like in the middle of Scarborough Town Center or like the Jane Finch Plaza, you're not going to go anywhere.
Yo, don't play. That's basically me growing up, okay?
Much love to Scarborough, much love
It
to
was
Jane
me
Finch.
too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's something that you touched on that really speaks to me as, I mean, I'm a continental African immigrant, you know, I'm Sudanese, so like immigrating from East Africa, like the context in which my blackness is constructed is very much against the Arab world in a particular way. So in that context, it's not whether you're black or white, it's whether you're black or Arab. And then coming here and transporting that and inheriting the history of blackness in this land, it's an entirely different experience, right? So all of a sudden we're learning the ways in which, you know, Canada as a state and this land has engaged with blackness, and then we're inheriting that oppression and bringing with us our own baggage, our own cultural context, all of that stuff. And I think something that's critical there is that how can the youth sector do better is black youth have to drive the solutions, because one, we're the resident experts on our lives. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I don't need you to save me. Frankly, I just need you to get out of my way.
Yes.
That would be the ideal scenario for me. And there's something that's also I notice very frequently in frontline youth work and youth serving organizations is a rewarding of respectability and proximity to whiteness. So then if you are a black kid who does not fit into that really tiny mold, if you are, for example, an academically successful black child, and there are many of us out there, or if you are, you're just not, you don't fit into that, the baggy jeans, red hoodie, Scarborough Town Center example that Joshua gave us there a moment ago, is that you are being rewarded, but you're being rewarded along the lines of you are not those black people, right? And I want to understand blackness, the multitude of blackness, and this expansive and complicated and diverse and nuanced set of experiences that everybody embodies differently. But I do not want to do it at the expense of other black people. I don't want to emulate a particular kind of whiteness and assimilate in that way. I would like to build a future where all of us can come with all of our parts. Mm-hmm. I see Martha is nodding and smiling. And do you have any stuff you want to add to this conversation?
I'm just appreciating the conversation, the richness of it all, and the depth of it all. But yeah, I really like the fact that we're starting from blackness that is rich and multi-layered, and it's marked with all kinds of differences. So we start from there, but without also losing that blackness is really a historical political process created by this discourse to put us in a certain space within the hierarchies of this society. Where I come from, it didn't matter. Like, black was the norm. Nobody even knew that they were. I didn't know I was black when I was back home in Africa. It's only after I came here, and people pointed to me and said, "Oh, please support that black writer." And I looked back. Who's the black writer? I didn't know I was black. It was at that moment that I started seeing myself as black. So I think there are reasons why societies classify their racialize, classify their population in certain ways, including along the racial lines. And it's to put us in very specific ways of the status hierarchy, the power hierarchy within the society. So it's not my skin color, it's not the melanin in my, it's the meaning that the society attaches to my blackness and calls me black. Mm-hmm. And it's that identity that I actually internalize and become black. So when I become black, part of me is actually submitting to that subjectification, the force that puts me into that slot of blackness. And part of me is also resisting it. So there's both resistance and complicity within even becoming that category of blackness. So we need to acknowledge that. So it is a marked space, and it is marked for a reason. That mark puts us in various positions within these webs of power relationships. And if we don't acknowledge that, then we fall prey to the essentializing discourses saying, "Oh, I'm black, it's my color," and even to the victim blaming you raised earlier, about, "Oh, it's your fault. If you don't make it, it's your fault. It's nothing has to do with the system, whatever." It's not. It has to do with the system, and it has to do how I internalize the system, and it's both. I also like to take on that. Don't take it personally thing. I had a huge battle with a very prominent Canadian writer, anti-oppressive writer, on that. Don't take it personally. You have to get this tough skin, whatever. I think we need to take it personally. And I have a reason why we need to take it personally, especially when we are the oppressors. Especially people who white folks, for example. Of course, whiteness is also very marked. It's a marked space. It's marked by all these differences. So I don't want to create that monolithic white people either. Just like I don't want to create that monolithic black people. But those with privilege, especially when it comes to those with privilege, like what you said, Siri? Yeah. That person, when we're privileged, we benefit from the system that puts us in a position of privilege. And if we don't, if we're not going to the marginalized group and say, "Okay, I'm here to help you," whatever, that is not what we want. That issue that marginalizes them, that boundary that creates me as privileged and them as marginalized, is the same boundary. It's a very political process that creates us and them. And if that boundary creates me as privileged, I am responsible for the other that is marginalized by that same boundary. So I don't want to go there and help them. I go there to liberate myself from this boundary that creates me as oppressor. So it is not their issue I'm looking at. It's my issue.
Mm-hmm.
So if I don't take it personally, because I wove this position of privilege into myself, this subjectivity into my sense of self, that self is being frayed when they point to me as privileged or oppressor or whatever. In that sense, I I don't fight for them, I don't struggle for them, I struggle for me to liberate myself. I really like that Australian Aborigine, it's very common, widely quoted uh, uh, saying from Lila Watson, if you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together.
Mm.
I like that because and if I don't take it personally, I won't take it as my issue. If I take it personally, I take it as my issue and work on my issue to liberate us both, not just them or me. And that boundary, I think, creates us both at the same time. If we work on that, well, that's my take on it. And people have been very defensive about that. And, oh, go ahead and immerse in your guilt if you want.
Mhm.
But it's not a question of guilt. It's a question of responsibility for the other, for the others that we create. So,
Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think if taking it personally is a conversation about accountability and responsibility, then
yes.
definitely take it personally. But if taking it personally means that you center your feelings and your position as and then you become defensive over those things, then I think I think a lot of the times when we talk about oppression, well, it's not my fault. I didn't do X, Y, or Z is the initial defensive reaction. And that I think the next part of that is to get down to the okay, well, your guilt doesn't pay my bills. Your guilt does not make sure that when my cousin gets pulled over by the cops, that he's going to get out of that interaction unharmed. Guilt doesn't do anything for me. I don't
Mm,
want guilt. I want us to be bound up in that sense of collectiveness that we can all get there and we can get there together. I feel like this question is leading us really well into our next question. I also want to take a moment to address something that was shared with us from one of the participants, which is a conversation around sometimes when we talk about the multi-layered nature of Blackness, and despite what our intentions are, and despite many of us identifying with that experience of being the young Black kid in the baggy jeans and a hoodie from Rexdale or Jane and Finch or Scarborough, we reduce that person to a caricature in a way. And I definitely want to address that because I mean, that was my experience growing up. I grew up in inner city neighborhoods like Regent Park and St. Jamestown, having immigrated to Canada as a teenager. So that there's a reduction of that caricature. That person is not nuanced or multi-layered, and we use them as kind of this caricature and then build layers of other Blackness from that person. And I think for so many of us, those that was me growing up. Those were the people that I grew up around. Those are the youth that I work with now, and they're sitting there at the intersection of so many um tremendous and nuanced identities. So I really want to thank the participant who brought that up um, in the discussion here online. And I want to ask all of us to reflect on the intersectionality piece more deeply. And the question is, why is it important to examine anti-Black racism through an intersectional lens, particularly as it applies to queer and trans Black youth, Muslim Black youth, Black youth with disabilities, and Black women and girls, and those of us who are living in a multitude of those intersections. Um, and we all know that these groups are disproportionately impacted and overrepresented in incarceration, both in state custody as children and in the criminal justice system, are disproportionately impacted by police violence, medical violence, poverty, mental health issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to invite all of us to reflect on that intersectionality piece. I know we did a little bit of that by virtue of all of these connections these questions being interconnected.
I feel like it'd be wrong for me or Cyril to speak first on this one.
I mean, I think, okay, so I'll expand a little, then I'll hand it over to Martha. And then I think I always appreciate it when cis Black men are like, I'm gonna just take a little backseat on this and let you have it. Thank you for that, Joshua. There's something that is intersectionality for me is important because of something that quote that Martha shared with us a little while ago, is that all of our liberation is bound up together. Is that I don't want to have to itemize and prioritize my identities, okay? And I cannot untangle them. I do not wake up one day and I am Black, and the next day I'm queer, the next day I'm a woman, and the next day I'm Muslim. I am all of those things at the same time. And there's so much narrative that erases the fact that women like me exist. Hello, yes, I can be. People are like, oh, so hold up, are you Black or are you Muslim? And I'm like, what? I'm very confused by this question. Or that, oh, you can't be Muslim and queer. I'm like, I can't. Like, the timeline hasn't erased me. I still exist. So apparently you can. So having these kinds of complicating what Black looks like, and then also the people who are on the outside, even inside our communities, need to be included in shaping what that liberation looks like. So for me, intersectionality is critical because it lets us understand, my experience of womanhood is always racialized by my Blackness. My experience of queerness is always impacted by my Muslimness. My experience of Blackness is always shaped by my experience as an immigrant. So I can't untangle these things from each other, and I can't say, okay, this part of my identity matters more, because all we're doing is reinforcing a power structure and a really toxic hierarchy. And I'm not really interested in who gets to be white people next. I would like to dismantle the entire system that says this is a power. I don't want to just take the power from someone else. I would like to dismantle the system that says you can have this kind of power. So for me, intersectionality is a mechanism by which we can be really critical. We can review that, and we can look at it in really pointed ways. And we cannot look at things like when we talk about, poverty as it impacts Black people, and then not talk about the tremendous impact of poverty on Black people living with disabilities and queer and trans Black youth, and how homelessness disproportionately impacts queer and trans Black youth. So for me, these conversations have to happen at the same time, simultaneously. There is room for all of it. And I don't want to do this whole, okay, well, we're just working on the Black thing now, we'll get to the gender thing later. And I'm like, well, the Black thing is always gendered for me. So I find it really toxic and harmful. And it just further pushes those who are chronically excluded into the margins. So for me, intersectionality is, I'm always grateful to Kimberly Crenshaw. When I say my prayers at night, I always think of her deeply, and many of the other Black writers, artists, and organizers, particularly Black women and queer and trans folk, whose work we actually use to pursue our liberation so frequently, but who are often absent from what our imagination of what liberation looks like.
Yep.
And I know that was like one long sentence with no punctuation on my end.
You're so articulate. It's really like you've said it all. Really, intersectionality is what we need to look at, because things don't happen. They all happen at the same time. Like you said, I don't wake up in the morning and become Black and live that Blackness, and then my womanhood the next day, whatever. They happen at the same time, and that actually is a wonderful space to be in, because you realize that you're not just one thing, you're a multitude of other things than just Black. And that Blackness is marked in 100 different ways. And a part of that Blackness could be oppressive to another Black person, even to another white person, or whatever. And all of that comes into being when we look at ourselves as in the lens of multiplicity, right? When we're multiple, then there are so many aspects of us that hurt, and that hurt itself, but that hurt others as well. And when I know that what I find in my experience is when I catch myself like red-handed doing harmful things to others because of my privileged position, wow, that really kind of humbles me very much and softens me up, and understand the privileged positions of others as well, because I have that too. I can do that too. I have the capacity to oppress. Means I can understand a little bit of the oppressor's reality as well, a little bit. So in that sense, I think it would open up areas of working together, areas of allyship. I don't like that the word ally, but even because these issues, each of these issues in which I am marked as privileged or marginalized, they are my issues. All of these, like the transgender issues, are my issues because I am privileged vis-a-vis that identity, that subjectivity. So if we take it as our issues, all of these things are our issues as human beings, as multiple beings. I think that would create a space for us to come together, both as oppressors and as oppressed. And I think what we're losing in this huge post-modern, post-structure discourses is that weakness. And for any kind of struggle to happen, for any kind of justice-oriented movement to happen, we need the we. And if we lose the we, become that reduced to that one I. So even though I'm all multiple, I can't speak for anybody else. Then I'm reduced to this one, and I'm disarmed. I don't have my power to fight against this injustice, even though I am also implicated and complicit in the oppressive system. I should be able to have that we to kind of launch a group-based movement and struggle for justice. So I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but I think that
No.
when we're really individualizing it and reducing it to just the I, we're losing that. And I'm really concerned about that we're losing.
Mm. Would I be able to share an anecdote here?
Please.
All right. So I think the first time I was ever introduced to the idea of working against or working in an intersectional manner was actually in, I wouldn't even call it a relationship. So there was just like a period of time where I was intimate with a person who was trans. And so they were like working on trying to figure out what their gender identity was. And for me, like and this sounds bad because there are Jamaican, so like I say this to say there are Jamaican people who are queer, who are trans. But in my experience, because I come from a pretty traditional, quote unquote, Jamaican family, that was like a no-no. The idea of sexuality had been a little bit more normal to me because I have cousins who are either bi or gay, and so that was easier for me to wrap my head around. I didn't have really oppressive ideology in that way, but when it came to gender and gender fluidity and all of those things, I was completely like I was lost in that. And then I had this relationship with this person, and the idea that they were white and I was a black person, but I'm a cis, what I thought heteronormative male. And I remember the first like 2 months of me knowing them, I called them she, and then realized that like after a point in time, I'm like, you've introduced yourself to me differently now. After realizing that like they said like, nah, my pronoun is they, this is who I am, me having to adjust that lens for them all of a sudden opened up my mind to all the ways I interact with black people who are trans, and realizing that like my stance before, because I didn't have a personal relationship with those people, I couldn't look at that lens of as being an oppressor because I thought, you know what, they're the same as me. And then realizing that like, oh, I was oppressive to trans people all this time because I wasn't using their pronouns. I was oppressive to trans people all this time because I was discriminating them, thinking that they were mentally ill, versus having an experience, an understanding of gender that I did not yet understand. And realizing like, if I don't have that intersection, I'm oppressing a whole group of people just by being complicit in it. So I wasn't going out of my way to be rude to trans people. I wasn't going out of my way to like use slurs or any of that stuff, but I wasn't acknowledging their reality at all. And that moment of like, there's an entire section of Black people who are being ignored by other Black people, not even oppressed. So like, there's people who are blatantly homophobic and blatantly transphobic, but I'm finding that's less and less common up here, in terms of like outward violence. Because like, again, I'm used to like the Caribbean level where like you show up on the street like that and there's songs about you getting shot that people sing along to out loud. Here, people will just look at you funny, not talk to you, and I realize that's wrong. Like, me being a Black male, not standing with my Black trans brother, sister, or Black trans sibling, and ignoring them is wrong. Ignoring their existence automatically blocks me off from a whole section of Black people I'm trying to help free. And it took me having that interaction of like me seeing a person who I could oppress while simultaneously being oppressed by, like, and it's sad that it had to come to that for me, but that idea of recognizing that small thing, when it comes to working in systems, is super important, because you can't, like, even just looking at things like legality. So if I say I am working for the liberation of Black men and women, and that's all I say, anyone from that point on who does not identify as a Black man or a Black woman but is also Black is left out of that statute. And if there's no legal protection for them, how am I supposed to enforce their rights or their freedoms? How am I supposed to go to a court and say this person hasn't been respected under the letter of law? That kind of thing is important in litigation and in actually having these conversations, and in doing that work, because if you're not specific, people will find loopholes to continue their oppression to work through. So yeah, that was just like a personal anecdote.
Thank you, Joshua. Cyril, did you have anything you want to add?
I have too many things I want to say. And I'm showing you that we need a lot more space for these conversations, and time has flown. We have maybe 30 minutes left or so, so I definitely want to be conscientious of the time for my contributions. But there are so many points that we've touched on. Intersectionality is essential for a liberation struggle that's genuine and that's realistic, because humans are not, monolithic nor just based on binaries. And so that expansion, I think, is very important to consider. Earlier we were talking about, so what is Black and what does Blackness mean? And, the social construct, I'll say, of a lowercase Black community or culture. To me, I see there's a type of Black community that's been constructed socially, but there's also a capitalized Black, which is actually a community of individuals and family members and different ethnicities that come together and identify as Black. That's a rich culture that contributes much, that has existed beyond any textbook we have in any university. So I think it's important to acknowledge that Blackness doesn't just exist in the construct of white institutions and structures. It's beyond that. But there's also a lowercase Black that is a social construct that's tied to economics, that's tied to social structures and that type of segregation. I also want to acknowledge that I'm using language that might be academic and not very accessible. And I think that's something that we have to question in the future as well, in terms of having these conversations and bringing people together. I also want to acknowledge that as a Black man speaking on some issues that touch on very sensitive topics in our community, that there is an acknowledged privilege there. But the thing I want to talk about is a sense of like this false privilege, because as a Black male in this society, I'm given a promise that, just like most people, right, we're given these concessions. If we abide by certain systemic rules, we will benefit in certain ways. I want to tie this back to youth programming, because I know a lot of people are like, wait, isn't this supposed to be about youth, the sector and all of that? So we can get back to that. But the privilege that I'm promised is that I'll be cool, and I can be cool, and I can get credibility, and I can be acknowledged as somebody with strength and power in the streets and, other places. And so with that promise, it's seductive, and I buy into it. And to participate in it, it's a toxicity of my humanity, where I cut off not only my other people's well-being and their relationship to me, I cut off parts of myself. I shut down emotionally. There are certain things I can't open and access when I enter that type of world and that type of reality. And that's something that's very deep that we need to be addressing. in youth programs. I know that there are strategies that are going to start rolling out for youth in the middle years and early years. It's a cultural hypnosis from the time you're born in this society, where you're just being taught, this is your value, this is your worth. And social media and pop culture and music videos, as was talked about, in one of the critical youth work courses where the participants were lecturing. I don't want to say brainwashing, but it's a constant barrage, a constant assault of your value, of who you are and who you can be. So when I'm walking around in the high schools, okay, you're going to be a basketball player, clearly, right? Because being a taller black man, there are certain catchments. I'm either in arts or I'm in entertainment, and that's where I'm valued. But when I want to rock a three-piece and walk down, I'm either a pimp, unfortunately, somebody that's thought about as exploiting other people's bodies for economic benefit, or I'm whitewashed, or I'm not connected. So even wearing something like this is a tool of resistance in a sense of how we're being typecast. So if I was wearing a hoodie today, I would be another type of Cyril, right? So these are the things in youth programs that we should start to consider in terms of the broader systemic issues that we've been talking about, but also the cultural frameworks where we see typecast and stereotypes of individuals rather than seeing ourselves. And let's not play a game where we think that we have empathy. Empathy is so valuable in person and crucial to our personality and interacting with other people in relationships, but we don't feel the pain. And there's been a lot of writing on this idea of stealing the pain of the other, Shreen Razik and others talking about that exploitation. So let's not pretend that once our hearts are bleeding and we're feeling bad, that we are feeling the same as those that we're trying to help. It's helping ourselves and working, as Dr. Kinosa said, right? Like our struggles are tied together. Our liberation is tied together. You're not doing a favor for me. You're doing a favor for yourself if you're trying to support me and achieving more liberation. So as youth, frontline supporters, as workers, having that framework, having that lens of intersectionality of, yes, I may have different experiences based on how the system is reading me and treating me, but I also have to be aware of how it's treating other people, how I'm an enabler in some of that oppression, some of that restriction, and consistently bringing that up. Because as my brother Joshua was talking, I was also thinking about my own challenges in this system, and I think in particular that struggle when we're looking at social justice movements. Now, this is an intra-community conversation that I'm having in a public forum, in a sense, where the relations between Black men and Black women are always rife with the opinions of others from the outside, and also in our community, how we have so many challenging struggles to bear. And so making a space for how I can be a sexist man participating in a patriarchal culture, and how I can be a benefactor of a toxic masculine society. I don't know if I'm going off too much. Is it making sense?
Yeah.
Having that introspection is important in my work of trying to get closer to my own sense of humanity and get closer to social justice principles and lenses. So my lens can't just be race. My lens has to incorporate gender, sexuality, ableism, etc. I have to incorporate this if I'm sincere in the struggle, and I have to do constant work. I have to do a lot of work. I'm not close to perfect. So I think tying that into youth work practice and critical youth work practice is just coming to the conversation, knowing that there are some gaps, some things that we'll never know, never be able to experience. And it's important to bring youth in and people that have embodied experience in, be able to speak to some of those challenges.
Thank you, Cyril. So I know that we're also getting questions on Twitter. So what I'm going to do for the sake of time is that I will stay on Twitter after the conversation, after the session is done. And if you tweet at me, I'll tweet back at you. I can't volunteer the other panelists to do so, but if people are around okay, perfect. You got Joshua for a little while longer. I know Martha's not on social media, but if you want to do that, we can do it that way as well. And as I'm getting the questions that you're sending to the organizers, I'll do my best to weave them into the conversation that we're having now. So you may not see your question word for word, but I will prompt so that it gets addressed in that particular way, just so that we're conscious of the time. I want to talk a little bit about the mental health and the healing conversation. I think this is something that is always coming up, and we don't always have the best language to talk about it. But the question is, how do we address the impact of racism on the mental health of Black communities? And how do we move from a culture of resilience to a culture of care and healing? So I want to invite everyone to kind of feel free to share from like a personal perspective, but also I want to talk to kind of people who are frontline workers. The conversation around resilience is something that deeply frustrates me. Um, I get that frequently because doing this work at the scale that I do is, oh, Ronnie, you're so resilient, you're so resilient, you're so resilient. I'm like, I don't want to be resilient. I would like to be soft and fucked up. That would be the best place that I would like to occupy. Please and thank you. Resilient means you can take it. Okay? Resilient means that you can handle this kind of violence. And in reality, we just don't have a lot of us just don't have the room to fall apart, even though we may want to. So giving room for that and not just rewarding resilience, I think is important, because I think when we celebrate Black strength, we forget the price of that. And a lot of youth workers and organizations doing youth work do so despite their best intentions, which is to reinforce that the narrative of resilience and to not give room for healing and care and just, like, do you have a space to come in and bring all of your parts, all of your baggage, all of your trauma, all of that, and not do it only to parade it and to get funding and to like do the work of like, packaging your trauma in whether it's along artistic or, even research lines, in order to convince someone else of the worth of your life, that you need access to those resources, or that even for entertainment, I see that a lot. I mean, I'm an artist, so that's part of my experience too, is that like can you write about Black joy, or does it only have to be about traumatic Black experiences that you can bring to a stage? Does that get you accolades, and do you get to be award-winning performer if you are coming and talking about absolute like Black like thriving, right? I would like to also imagine us thriving at some point in time. So I think for the youth sector to think of those things in like really broad terms, and to really reflect on those things critically in terms of your programming and your policies and how you engage with Black communities, particularly with young Black people, because that normalizes that kind of trauma and reinforces it in really violent ways. So I would like to invite everybody else to contribute to that, please and thank you.
I want to jump right in this one. For the work I do, I work with the Toronto Public Library right now, running a program called Poetry Saved Our Lives. And the the culture around poetry right now, specifically around spoken word, is what I love to call, and what other people have popularized, called trauma porn. And the idea that you just take like the worst things that have happened to you and morph them into these really graphic, brutal pieces, and then call it healing or call it like therapy. And what I find so often when you want to talk about healing, when you want to talk about creating a culture of care, it's first of all acknowledging that these things can be professionally done. I grew up with the idea that therapy was like this place you got sent if you were absolutely bonkers and there was no hope for you, and therapy was the last place, was like a last resort before they threw you in a straitjacket. And I remember going in, I had an argument with my parents, and my mom decided I needed to go to therapy because I was at the end of my rope with my mental health. And I remember sitting down with that therapist and nothing. Like, it was one of the worst experiences I had, hands down. I was 15 when I went into therapy. I am 24 right now. So I was 24 the first time I went to therapy willingly after that. So it was 9 years. And there's a whole lapse of trauma that went through that. And in the meanwhile, I'm trying to mentor youth. I'm trying to like help them express themselves. And I'm grateful that I was given the opportunity by men in my life to cry and to have that room of self-expression that was healthy. But in terms of creating a space for healing, like, people need to be comfortable with the idea that not holding it together is necessary sometimes. In Black families, as far as I can speak from my experience, you aren't allowed to have a moment of weakness. I remember during the Black Lives Matter, like the first wave, right after Mike Brown was murdered, and the trial happened, I remember like having a meltdown and just like not being able to get up in time for work one day. And not because I was tired or I needed an excuse, like I was physically sobbing in my bed half an hour after my shift started, like unable to process that. And I posted about it, and then my dad, who was well intentioned, says like, I understand that it's rough, but you got to keep going because they look for opportunities like this to break you, and you just got to hold on. And that was just like, that's a year of repression. From that point on, nothing fazed me. I was good. Like, I was angry, and that's as far as it would get, not realizing the damage I was doing to myself, and the hypervigilance I was creating in my environment and for the people I was mentoring in that environment. For people to care for each other and to begin to heal, you have to be given the ability to show your wounds. And while like Malcolm X talks about like, if a knife is still, 3 inches in your back after it's been 9 inches in your back, like your wounds have to heal. But I mean, like, you got to start recovery somewhere, like somewhere. And the idea that like we need all of our situations removed to start doing some of the work, is harmful to these Black kids who are like at some point so sensitive, and they won't admit they're sensitive. I was in a workshop the other day where like these two kids got into a fight over like moving a notebook. And like you'd think, oh wow, these kids are super aggressive. And it's no, they're sensitive because they're exposed to so much and aren't given any professional outlet that's socially acceptable for them to step to.
Yeah, I want to reflect on that when we talk about mental health support for Black youth, I want to really invite us to think about whether those solutions are culturally relevant for the youth that we're engaging with. Often we're being asked to go and, go into therapy and programs that actually don't make sense for us, our cultural context, our understanding of the world. And I mean, let's not act like people who are mental health care professionals and healthcare professionals in general do not have a very well documented history of tremendous violence against Black people. That to me is really important. And I mean, I don't blame Black people when we have deep mistrust of medical and mental health institutions. We know what they've done to us in the past. So that's something that I want to plant. But I know in our previous conversation, Cyril, you had some points that you made in our chat before the session. So I would love to hear from you about this.
There was a question that was phrased around, are Black youth more susceptible to mental illness? And I wanted to question the idea of illness in terms of being framed as like being deviant in terms of what our social expectations or professional expectations would be to this golden standard of mental capacity, or in other words, sanity. This culture is quite insane. And so, we have to take those systems, and I use that word to kind of say that those that think differently, that express themselves differently, that are not in line with expectations that are standardized, have much to contribute, more than they're often accredited for. And that our particular approaches to meeting that with medication from pharmaceutical companies and exclusion and silencing and incarceration are not productive to human growth. I'll say that as kind of a sidebar of this. So that's on the mental illness. And the other thing is like, are Black youth more this, are Black youth that? It's important to identify communities that strategically we need to build resources around, because there's a history of marginalization. But Black youth are human beings. So are human beings more susceptible to feeling hurt, emotional hurt, when you tell them that they are less than? Well, the answer is yes. And we can start to have that conversation as human beings, not these exoticized creatures that, we kind of see running around and feel bad for them. They're us, we are them. So again, as Dr. Kumasa said, around that language of I and we, if you want to help Black young people in your program, the key is stop being a gatekeeper for programs and opportunities for them to know themselves.
Martha?
I can leave it at that.
Yeah, you really are raising a very, very important issue, but it's at the end of the time. But I think it's for the youth sector, whatever is called youth sector, for whoever wants to support the Black people, Black youth. This is one of the very important areas, mental health and trauma. Many youth, like I work with youth who come from back home, wherever, Africa, with traumatic experiences, but they don't tell anybody because, one, their parents don't want them to be weak. more people are suffering back there. People are dying back there. We need to stand up and help those people who are suffering, our people who are actually in real danger. We are in a safe place now, so hold up, stand strong. Let us stand strong for them and help them. In the meantime, these youth are carrying this unaddressed, unexamined, unidentified trauma within themselves. But there's also the age of youth, they're so, they want to feel strong, they don't want to feel weak, because trauma means weakness. Seeking professional help means weakness, and they don't want to exhibit that weakness. They need to be strong, they need to be standing and supporting others. So that's what they really carry when they need real help. But again, what help do they get if they go? What the youth sector can help with is that professional trauma counseling or whatever counseling, or even mental health counseling. May not be for us, may not be for our youth. There are 100 different creative ways we can come up with about the culture of care within our communities for our youth that have not been explored, that we need to actually invest energy and time and money into, rather than just taking them to professional helpers who don't have any idea about the trauma, who don't have any idea about the culture. There are many other ways of caring for our youth, and I think that needs support, and we need to do the research and come up with creative strategies of healing our youth and ourselves. I think that's very, very important. And as we said, in celebrating the excellence and the strength and the resilience, there's a lot that gets lost, and that the pain and the suffering that they are harboring within gets lost. So we do need to get to those pains, and we need to heal each other. And that is it really requires a culture of care that is different from professional care.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think we live in a world where independence is this thing that, that is so deeply rewarded and edified in really problematic ways. And I mean, I believe in interdependence and mutually assured survival. Nothing like growing up in the hood, like living in the inner city, teaches you that lesson very quickly. That when people don't have a lot, they do a lot for each other. So that's something to think about, is how can we take care of each other in those ways. There's been a lot of questions that are coming up from the audience right now. We do not have a mountain of time left. We have just a little bit of time. I want to invite everyone also to quickly reflect on what celebrating Black excellence looks like, and how we can do that outside of the boundaries of respectability politics. To me, when my hairstylist hooks up my hair and I'm like, these braids are like, my edges are laid, my braids are beautiful, that to me is Black excellence. That's Black art and architecture. And I want to invite our minds to be expanded on what Black excellence really looks like. And then also there's a question that was for Cyril that's coming in from the participants, that if you can expand a little bit on what it means to be a gatekeeper when you're working in the youth sector.
So we're doing a lot of talking. We have privilege to talk on this platform, which is wonderful, but there are frontline youth workers who are racialized, and many that are Black. There are teachers that have African ancestry that have a lot of insight and know the stuff that we're talking about, and can really move mountains in terms of making really great recommendations for your organization to do better. So listen, please, and open up space for them to be able to bring their visions and their knowledge, their lived embodied knowledge, we can call it tacit knowledge, to the table to make things better, because they're working with young people. Also, bring the young people themselves, the Black young people, to the table to start developing ways to move forward in a productive way. If we're thinking about systems change, again, going back to the beginning of the conversation, what's at stake? Are we willing to have meetings move to a less convenient time? Are we willing to factor in budgets to make things a little bit more accessible for young people in terms of transportation and food? Are we willing to work with individuals that might make us uncomfortable when we have some trust issues about where they're coming from and what their intentions are? But are we going to create a gate and block them out from participating because of our own lack of understanding and connection? Sometimes it's really just easier. Just give me the grant money to run this program and things run. it's easier to kind of not work with the communities, but try to do for communities. But that's actually destructive. And we're working against the missions and mandates of our program by participating in that kind of behavior. I kind of forget the question.
Yeah, no, I definitely addressed it, which was about what it looks like to be a gatekeeper. I see that a lot in my community. I mean, I live and work in Regent Park in St. Jamestown, and one of a lot of the things that happen in Regent Park is people come and try to do for Regent. I'm like, Regent's been doing for ourselves. So you don't actually need to come and do anything for us. We actually have a lot of expertise, particularly the young people in this community. That program you're applying for $100,000 to run has actually been running out of some auntie's basement for like 10 years. So figuring out how we do things in different ways of knowing and being, and our models for things look different sometimes. I think accepting that, and that, like, you know, those structures in which we used to doing youth organizing in and like youth focused service provision don't always make sense for Black communities, particularly those of us who are living at the intersection of many marginalized identities. So that's something that I wanted to touch on. I also, there was a conversation around some questions around what it looks like to you know, to not save me but get out of my way. And really, I think that what's really important about that is that the piece around trust is that Black youth are the experts on what it means to be Black youth. Even I mean, I'm very quickly exiting youth territory. So as I do that, the youth that I work with all stay the same age because there's new ones all the time, and I get older and older and older, and my insights shift, and I don't always have an immediate grasp on their lived experience as it stands now. So them being in the driver's seat is critical, and for them to be in the driver's seat, that means somebody who is in that seat right now has got to get on up out of there. That has to be part of that understanding, right? Is are you going to invite me for a seat at the table when you know there are no more chairs because you are not willing to give up that place? For me, that kind of not gatekeeping. I always talk to people about what diversity looks like. Diversity is a rainbow that just happens to be the way that it is. However, for me, meaningful inclusion is the intentional labor of not only more than a seat at the table. Don't invite me to your dinner party after you have made all the decisions on what we're eating, after you've chosen our table settings. I want to fold our napkins into swans and not opera houses. Everybody knows that's cuter. Maybe I eat with my hands. Maybe my friend Amy uses chopsticks. Maybe your friend is in a mobility device and that table is too high for him. Maybe the bathrooms in this space are gendered. Maybe the place is inaccessible. Maybe it's Ramadan and I'm fasting. At the end of the day, if we are not in the part of designing what the world looks like, and the world being our programming, all the way from a youth program in meta and large terms into a liberated and free world that includes all of us, if we are not part of the design process of it, the decision-making process of it, if we are not where the power currently lies, it will not be made for us. This, I know people start to, this is when people start to send me messages about being radical and whatever, but at the end of the day, if we cannot be in the driver's seat of our own liberation, that liberation will be ill-fitting.
May I say something quickly?
Please.
On the idea of the finances and the resources that are available to support community programs. So if it's saying, leave us alone, let us do our own thing, it's not saying that the contributions of the Black community for many centuries in this nation don't deserve the appropriate financial support and backing and resource support and backing to be able to accomplish things that is within their human right to accomplish. So I wouldn't say that the talk about having those with the most stakes leading the charge is saying that institutions and resources and individuals that have other contributions, it could be financial, could be certain expertise in areas and resources, are to be totally disenfranchised from that liberation movement and process. It's just a matter of shifting the mentality to say, let me not try to lead the charge and determine where things go and how they go. Let me be a part of this in a way that's appropriate for me to be a part of this. And, you know, that might not be at the helm of the front.
I appreciate that. Joshua, any final thoughts or things to add?
And just
yeah,
just to add to that, you know, sometimes when funds are grants are given to programming, youth programming and everything, and youth need to run them, and they don't have the skills and whatever, that funding it really needs to also include the training that they need to actually be able to handle that. Otherwise, they would be set up to fail from the beginning. That, we've given them the funds, they squandered it. They didn't do much you know, they squandered it. They failed. So the failure itself comes back to the youth. If it's not really, when they need to have the skills first, and they need to kind of that funding has to have a part where the capacity building is also included, and youth are able to manage that fund forever. So I think there's that piece that has been my experience in the community, where youth were blamed because they didn't know how to manage the funds. How about the management skills first, not or with it? How about the fund addressing that management skills? I think, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm, but yeah, it is.
Can I throw a quick piece in there? Another piece of encouragement is, please pay young people on time, if not in advance. And for community partners, please ensure that the way that they are compensated is honored in a way that doesn't bring them through a lot of struggle. So let's think about that constantly, whether we're a frontline youth worker, administrator. Let's think about how we're honoring and valuing and the way we're treating people. The dollar is not what's most valuable. Money comes and goes. It's the way you treat people. So let people know their time is valuable by honoring them with consideration. I think that's something important that agencies listening can take in for insight as well.
Joshua?
When it comes to agencies, especially, I think, or groups who apply for grants moving into communities that they aren't a part of. So I'll specifically speak to those. One, remember that your work is work done by an outsider. So you're not going to be able to fix any problems you don't really know about. In my mind, speak to the community leaders of the communities you're going into. Speak to the youth who you're going to serve, and go in with the attitude that you're going to serve them, not that you're going to save them or do some work to transform their community. They'll be there long after you're gone. And if you're just putting, their name on your grant so that it looks good on your grant so you can get some extra money in your pocket, don't get that grant. Forget your money. Step your hustle up somewhere else. That idea to me is wild, that you would step into a community posing to serve it so you could get some extra dollars in your pocket. Don't do that if you're part of an organization. Second thing would be trust the people who are there to understand the work they're doing. For me, whenever I go into a community with an organization, sometimes I even neglect the idea of going to a singular community. I'll say, these are people who I know can go back to their communities and do the work if I train them and equip them with the tools that I have. So like, if these youth are under my mentorship, like, I haven't been to Regent in a hot minute to do mentorship work. And so I would never go into a program there unless someone's bringing me in to mentor someone else to do the work in their community since they're already there. That's a whole different situation than me bringing in a program myself. So know where you're needed. And if you're going to go in there anyway, then make sure that you've spent some time and invested well after the money's gone. Are you willing to be there after your money's dried up? Are you willing to be involved in mentorship after you're not getting paid to do it? Are you willing to volunteer your time? That's how you invest in a community. That's how you make a community better.
Thank you for that, everybody. I'm going to leave people with like 3 to-do things. I know that a lot of the times we're looking for some tangible things that we can do in the work that we're doing. The first thing is that examine how you, at your space, your organization, or yourself are looking at data, knowledge production, and knowledge transmission. Are you collecting these demographic-based data, intersectional demographic-based data? And there was a conversation around whether we can collect data as Black as a category in data collection that came up before the session. And I think that's really critical, because when we do collect data as people of color that includes Black people and other racialized groups in one lump section, and then we go ahead and we collect people of color excluding Black people, we collect Black people, we see the massive disparity. We have to understand that in the context of this land, all racism is rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous colonialism. So we have to really, that there will be severe disparities that we need to understand. And I've come to understand in my own work that anti-Blackness is the most accessible currency of white supremacy. Everybody trades in it. So being conscious of that is important. And then reflecting on how your institution has been anti-Black in the past. Like I literally, this is not like a metaphorical question. Like, I want answers. This is homework. Write me an email, okay? This is the ways that we've been anti-Black in the past. And also, on a personal note, start revolutions at your kitchen table. It irks me when I meet people who are talking about intersectionality and the work of justice and doing all this work, and then I go and meet them and see how racist they are with their families. Go talk to your racist auntie and your mama and your uncle and your granny, everybody, okay? Go be the person who's ruining every dinner party like me, okay? I know it's uncomfortable, but those Black youth are not only in your program, they're out there in the world, and those people are going out and doing harm to them. So that's something that I want everyone to like really sit with and reflect on. And then also invite critique from Black communities. You don't have to be reactionary to critique. Okay, you can absolutely build mechanisms to receive that kind of feedback and to have real tangible accountability plans. And when you ask Black people for their opinions, their insights, their lived experiences, when you ask Black people to package their trauma, their joys and everything and send them to you, I want to know what you're doing with that. I want real solid answers. I do not want to go through all that labor for you to look like you're consulting with Black communities, but I want a tangible commitment. And sometimes that tangible commitment looks like numbers. We are going to hire this many more Black people inside our organization. We are going to engage, put money, dollars, okay? Money talks. We live in a capitalist world, unfortunately, and money is needed for survival. And like I said, I would like enough of us to be out there to, you know, to see that when we get there. And lastly, when you are working with Black youth, ask the question, what do you need? There is something remarkable about that. What do you need? That you would be amazed at saying, well, I don't need this, I actually need that. And then you can actually, your impact is amplified tremendously. So definitely the data piece, the knowledge production piece, figuring out how to share that information publicly, publishing accountability reports, and being honest with yourself and with the community about all the ways in which you have messed up in the past and all the ways you intend to do better. Making tangible, concrete commitments to meaningful inclusion of Black people, not only in entry-level positions in your space, in your organization, and in your programming, but in leadership roles, giving up power so somebody else can take it. I'm super, super grateful for everyone who's been here today. I know we could talk for absolutely ever. Like I said, you can tweet at me. I will be on Twitter for the next few hours, and I'll be happy to answer you. You can also email me. It's Rania@RaniaRights.com, but I'll put it on my Twitter, so you can also get at me that way. I'm super grateful for all of you who could join us today. We've had somewhere between 100 and 130 participants, and throughout the session. Please read the reports and the handouts that you got here today. People have gone to great lengths to produce this information, and I would love for all of us to amplify the impact of it, to share it as widely as possible. Thank you to the YouthREX organizers. Thank you, Cyril. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Martha. I'm super grateful to be here with you today. I'm sure the rest of us are just going to continue chatting because these conversations go on forever. Anyhow, have a remarkable day, and hopefully, I don't know if it's cold where you are now, but it's cold here. But just remember, we are literally 8 weeks from spring solstice. You can get there. Less than 8 weeks.
Okay. Thank you so much. You're so insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.